Welcome and good morning, and thank you for joining us for this webinar highlighting the research of our network members at Eating with the Ecosystem. My name is Lawton Elliott DeAngelis, and I am the coordinator of the Local Catch Network. Local Catch is a hub for knowledge exchange and innovation to support and catalyze local and community-based seafood systems. Today, the network is made up of more than 500 members, including over 200 seafood businesses from across North America. Members of the Local Catch Network align with a set of core values that aim to create a higher level of accountability and trust, both internally within the network and externally to the public. Local Catch Network members include seafood harvesters who sell their catch locally through direct marketing channels, as well as those engaged in research, technical assistance, and community organizing. Today, we are joined by Eating with the Ecosystem, who are here to share their compelling research about climate winter seafood species. They will intro their research shortly, but first let me introduce them. Kate Masery is the Executive Director of Eating with the Ecosystem, with the mission of promoting a place-based approach to sustaining New England's wild seafood through healthy habitats, flourishing food webs, and short, adaptive seafood supply chains. Their programming includes a combination of educational events, citizen science and seafood system research, supply chain facilitation, and public awareness raising through print, web, and signage. Kate is joined today by Nikki Roberts, the program coordinator at Eating with the Ecosystem and project lead. Her background in fisheries supply chain research led her to pursue a number of community-based projects aimed at expanding consumer palates for local seafood and identifying regulatory and economic barriers to diversifying supply chains. She has a passion for bringing together stakeholders to devise market-based solutions for local seafood from boat to plate. And with that, I will turn it over to Kate to introduce the research.
Thanks, Lawton, and welcome everyone. I see some familiar faces and names, so we're excited to have you here, and also some new faces and names, which is great. Lawton did a great job of introducing kind of us. As he mentioned, I'm Kate Masery. I'm the Executive Director of Eating with the Ecosystem. We're a nonprofit. We're based in Rhode Island, and our focus area is all of New England. And this project is one of the research projects that we've been working on. And Nikki has been the lead on this project. And so she's going to kind of share more of the results, but I'd like to introduce the project for us. And this session in particular is part of an informal, part interactive, with the objective of helping to inform a new market development guide. And this guide aims to provide seafood businesses and decision makers with informal tools to build resilience into the future and best be able to really utilize climate-ready seafood species as our oceans continue to change. So to give you an idea of our focus and why we'd like you to why we wanted to particularly engage this group kind of in the conversation is our project aims to help seafood businesses adapt when faced with species shifts due to warming waters. These shifts may present challenges, but also opportunities to utilize what we're referring to as climate winter species. And so we'll refer to that term throughout the presentation, but what we mean by it is species that are either expected to or are already expanding into a particular region within the next couple of decades as a result of warming water, or species that help to reduce kind of climate impacts, such as kelp or bivalves. The motivation for this work began with a recent research project where Nikki and I investigated how prepared and motivated businesses in New England are to take advantage of these shifts. And we're going to begin this discussion with a presentation of that research and what it indicates about the future of New England seafood supply chains and how we can support more positive developments there. Based on the needs and strategies of the businesses we interviewed during that research, Eating with the Ecosystem has decided to collaborate with seafood suppliers on this next step to create a roadmap for climate resilient seafood supply chains to help support much needed flexibility throughout the supply chain and the regulatory environment. As we begin the process of forming this report, we're really interested in hearing from local catch network members because because in our research, we found that many of the most adaptive businesses in our set share the same values and interests as many of the local catch network members. And those are the precise perspectives and strategies that we really need to represent kind of in this report and support at a systems level. The main focus of this webinar is really going to be to understand kind of what elements you want to structure the plan around so that we may best serve your businesses and business adjacent members in the face of species shifts due to climate change. So we're going to start with an overview of the research and the results, which will help provide context for the roadmap, followed by a group discussion with everyone here to help determine what policy changes, what market conditions, infrastructure investments, or other forms of support would be helpful for your business to adapt to species shifts moving forward, and what initiatives or efforts already are in existence that we should be highlighting kind of and maybe increasing the prevalence of. And so while the research itself that we have conducted has been New England focused, the conversation, especially towards the end when we get to where we'd love feedback from you guys, we really want that to move beyond the region to include all local catch network members and those of you joining from Eating with Ecosystems kind of network as well. So it won't be limited to New England at that point. So to set the scene before we begin, the main objectives of this research project were to understand climate adaptability from a supply chain perspective. How willing are businesses to incorporate climate winter species? What are the barriers for doing so? And what might explain this adaptability? So now I want to kind of share the process and how we kind of started the project. So we conducted semi-structured interviews with 27 different seafood businesses throughout the New England region. Our sample excluded retail-only businesses and fishing-only businesses, but those functions could be performed by a business as long as the business also dealt with kind of the middle of the supply chains, for example, offloading, processing, distribution, wholesale, anything kind of within that category. So if they had a retail component to their business, they were also included. If they had a fishing component to their business, they could also be included, but we didn't include just fishermen or just retail markets. So with respect to the interviews, we wanted to know how likely these businesses were to incorporate climate winter species, and why they were interested in incorporating them and limitations to incorporating them. And as I said before, an important piece of the study was to start to get to the question of what makes them more or less prepared to take advantage of species shifts. And so that we can begin to figure out what business models we should be promoting and supporting. We collected business structure and strategy characteristics also kind of within this research. And these include the history of the business, different dimensions about their business model, who they sell to and buy from, like the types of businesses, and what species they offer. So like their portfolio kind of. And so when you heard kind of our definition of climate winter species earlier, it may have like gotten your gears turning on what those could be. Our research focused on 12 species, 6 that were predicted to be moving into kind of the northern New England region, and 6 that were predicted to be moving into the southern New England region. And we base these choices kind of based on 4 criteria. These species were selected to pique the interest of a variety of businesses so that we could discern what was encouraging and what was limiting, kind of. We could have definitely selected more species and intend to experiment with more, especially in this roadmap to climate resilience and hearing feedback from all of you. But given the scope of the project, we had to limit it somewhere. And so we chose a wide variety of species based on kind of the science and the ecological data suggesting that they might be shifting in abundance and shifting in territory, but also we were looking at culinary characteristics, fishing characteristic, like the fishing harvest of them characteristics, and other factors that were kind of important in our decision making. And so now for the results, and we're looking at, I want to pass kind of this area over to Nikki to begin. So Nikki, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thanks, Kate. So the results, as Kate kind of laid out, really what we're building towards is the conclusions about how willing these suppliers, the businesses that we talked to, were to take on these new climate winter species, and what could be explaining that adaptability. So we can really start to isolate, what are these traits that may be underpinning adaptability to species shifts. You can advance to the next slide. Thank you, Kate. So broadly, what we found with nearly all of the businesses in the set is a willingness to incorporate at least one of the climate winter species presented. And actually about half of the businesses have already incorporated at least one of these species. But having said that, the businesses were degrees different in terms of how many species they were willing to incorporate. Remember that we had 6 presented to Northern New England businesses, so north of Boston, and 6 presented to the Southern New England businesses. And in addition to that, under what conditions they may be willing to do so, and what could be explaining their reasoning. So using our interview responses, we are able to generate what we're calling typologies. So these are categories of businesses that kind of share a certain degree of willingness to incorporate these climate winter species, and then some of the same characteristics to match that could explain why they felt why they felt a certain way, why they had those perceptions. The 4 typologies were climate winter adaptable. That's the first group. Multi-strategy, what we're calling general, and niche. So these are categories. The terms themselves are terms that we've made up and devised based on what characteristics they present. So I think the titles will make more sense once we get into them. But in this list, the first 2 are the most similar, and the last 2. So we're going to start with the first 2, and the first one being climate winter adaptable. And so this business, I think, will resonate most with the folks on this call. And that's because the typical profile of this type of business is small or medium in size. They tend to focus on supplier-driven sourcing, really recognizing that, local fishermen and their security is a critical piece to success in the supply chain. They tended to take accordingly all of the catch from a given fisherman, wherever they're sourcing from. And they had a lot of knowledge about those species, how to handle them. They had to, in order to have it as part of their portfolio. And they really focused too on community involvement and education and outreach, and kind of expanding consumers' ideas of different fish species and familiarity with those. And how that translated to kind of their perception of climate winters was generally very positive, as you might be able to imagine. So all businesses were willing to incorporate at least one of the climate winter species presented. And they were one of the business types with the highest average number of climate winter species that they would be willing to incorporate. And this fit with the way that they had responded to species shifts in the past, which they reported. Supply shifts in response could include utilizing their seasonal portfolio in a number of ways, adapting on both the supply and the demand side. And I mentioned that the first 2 categories, so the climate winter adaptable and then this category, multi-strategy, had the highest ratings for adaptability to species shifts. And you can probably see why for the climate winter adaptable. It's pretty obvious, but for multi-strategy, it was kind of a category that surprised us, just because it's so different in a lot of ways from the climate winter adaptable category. So first, they were medium to large size businesses, tended to incorporate a variety of both local and non-local species into their portfolio. yet they actually ended up being willing to incorporate the highest average number of climate winner species of all businesses in the set. And some were also very excited by the challenge, by the kind of marketing challenge that this presents. And the answer to why this might be the case, I think, really lies in their capacity. So they had many markets to choose from. Being larger in scale, they were able to kind of reach those markets a little bit easier. They had the capital to process those species in addition, and really they understand emerging markets as well. So the two, in summary, kind of the multi-strategy and the climate winner adaptable, they have vastly different business profiles, as you can tell, but both could champion the climate winner species in their own ways, which I think is important when we consider, small scale to large scale businesses being able to utilize and take advantage of species shifts. But the next two business types will be lower on that adaptability scale when we're measuring it in terms of the willingness to embrace climate winners, and you'll see why. The next slide. So the first type is the general type. So you can see that only 60% of these businesses were willing to incorporate any climate winner species, and that's compared to 100% of all of the other businesses. And this makes some kind of intuitive sense, I think, when we consider the standard characteristics of the business. So they tend to do wholesale distribution, and they need large volumes to operate. They're kind of high volume businesses. Which many of the climate winner species actually did not offer. And they also operated on kind of the needs of the customer rather than supplier needs, rather than kind of the demands of harvest. So in that way, they tended to be a little bit more disconnected from what was going on in the local environment and more focused on that demand for their kind of limited demographic markets like distributors and kind of larger restaurants servicing more conventional species. So in that way, the values of the local climate winner species didn't attract them as much, they weren't as enticing because they didn't fit with their business model. And then moving on to the last category, this is the niche, what we're calling the niche category. So these businesses were likely to be interested in climate winner species. So that makes them, different from the general business types. After all, they did source mostly from fishermen, but because of their limited services that they offered, they tended to not offer processing or retail, and also their limited sources and customer base, that made them kind of at the whims of the suppliers and buyers. So they didn't have a whole lot of bandwidth to kind of switch up their portfolio. And these businesses were both kind of small and large in size. But the bottom line was really that kind of limited capacity, especially with regard to providing these services that didn't give them as much autonomy and flexibility when it came to incorporating these new species. And before we go into kind of the implications of those business types, those 4 business types we discussed on kind of climate adaptation and where we go from here, I also just want to note some of the patterns we observed in the climate winner species and specifically the businesses' perceptions of the climate winners. Traits that each of these species may have possessed that were desirable by the businesses. So I'll go through several of the most widely desired species and then the reasons why. And the reasons why are on the left-hand side in the qualities section. So you can see in that column there. So starting with black sea bass and red drum, businesses noted that they had a good texture and they were high value species as well. Silver hake and puffer had good restaurant potential, and that was because they were a little bit more on the unknown side of it required restaurateurs to be a little bit more creative, and that's something that is more conducive to a restaurant setting. Squid actually had a longfin squid had a number of positive characteristics, high value and high volume, which is kind of a rare combination. Its yield was seen as very good as well. And they also had restaurant potential. There's a lot of ways to be creative with squid. Spanish mackerel was mostly higher yield, and also was filletable and very versatile. Summer flounder as well was filletable, had a very good mild taste and flavor, and also had a lot of restaurant potential as well. And I think everybody who lives in the Northeast has probably seen that at one point or another at a restaurant. And Atlantic croaker is a high volume species. It was one of the only species that the businesses noted was more high volume. So for those like the general and kind of niche businesses, that was a positive takeaway. And we already mentioned that the multi-strategy and climate winter adaptable businesses, the first two categories we discussed, are different in terms of their kind of base willingness to incorporate climate winter species, what might be driving that, but they both seem to be kind of equally receptive, and that requires flexibility and innovative thinking. Those are two kind of overarching traits. And in fact, a subset of these businesses, so 7 in total, what we saw in our research, saw kind of the emerging status of many of these species as an opportunity to grow their business and the industry in New England. These traits seem to have a substantial overlap with the local catch network core values, which is indicated by these icons. So I just wanted to note some of the kind of crossover, because this gets into really why we wanted to talk to this group. So they include the core value of eating with the ecosystem. So these businesses that were really excited about climate winter species, they seem to have a lot of high species knowledge, meaning a wide variety of species. They knew how to deal with them, as well as flexible processing infrastructure. And both of those things really connect to the eating with the ecosystem core value. Traceable and simple supply chains was another local catch network core value, and that was really expressed through the local product focused business models that these businesses employed. And also kind of thinking about maximizing value of local suppliers, honoring the ocean is another core value. And I think that really connects back to the sourcing direct from fishermen, sourcing a majority of their catch from fishermen. And that really comes down to knowing who catches it, prioritizing those players. Community-based values was another one. I think that's kind of tied in very easily with the community-based fisheries pillar for local catch network. And I think lastly, embracing creativity and collaboration with these retail markets or retail outlets that cater to consumers of all kinds. And then also just embracing the underutilized status of climate winners, finding interesting ways to market and sell those. And this really forms the flexible attitudes towards seafood species that we see as very important, something that needs to be uplifted in future actions to build climate resilience. So if we think about that, I think these several characteristics are really kind of the North Star. That's the culmination of our research kind of coming to life. And you can really take that and that's what we're trying to do to see what else we can do with that in the future. And lastly, there were a number of challenges that we documented in the research to kind of maintaining this level of flexibility that we discussed and kind of protecting those values. So satisfying consumer tastes and trends was the most popular issue mentioned. Perhaps unsurprisingly, this kind of indicates a sort of tension between businesses that want to support local fishermen, but also have to cater to the tastes and preferences of their market basis. Inflexible quotas was another one that resonated with businesses of all sizes, most often the ones working directly with local fishermen, because they're really seeing what's going on the water locally and how that's affecting their bottom line and what they can offer. A lack of fishermen in the industry was also concerning for many, mostly small businesses kind of facing those challenges right now, especially with ground fish, and staffing shortages, as you may expect, would affect businesses of all sizes. And finally, capacity issues were mainly reported by small businesses with less capital. So you can think of those as the niche businesses, that last category we discussed. And I'm going to repeat this again, just because I think it's a really important point that all of what we were able to evaluate kind of came down to, if you really distill it, flexibility in both supply and demand, and kind of finding ways to support that. And I think this insight and the traits we were able to evaluate, they kind of provide the foundation that we need to start to build solutions that allow, businesses of all sizes to kind of take advantage of local species shifts. And we appreciate you listening to, this part of the webinar. And we hope it kind of gave you a primer and context for the action plan. We're going to talk about how we're taking these results and I'm trying to put them into a more usable and useful format for businesses. So we'll be discussing that in the next section. But before we get there, just wanted to kind of pause and give a moment for any questions that you have that may have developed while you were listening to the research.
And for your questions, you can either kind of like unmute and speak them, or if you want to put them in the chat, we can also take a look at them from there. If you don't have questions, we can move on and get to the feedback portion or whatever that we'd love to collect some information from you guys about as well.
Yeah, I think the most important thing is making sure that, this has a clear and kind of coherent narrative for everybody, because that feeds directly into the work that we're going to talk about now.
All right, so I see one question in the chat. It says, sorry if I missed this, but how did you choose the climate winter species to ask and question about? And so I can start with this one, Nikki. So we chose the climate winter species based on a number of different factors. One was ecological studies that had been done. We looked at the drawn hair study in particular, looking at what species were kind of predicted to shift in abundance or increase in abundance kind of in the given areas. And we looked at a number of different studies for that, and we chose some species based on that. But we could have chosen a lot more species than just the ones that we had chosen based on ecological factors. And so we also wanted to look at kind of fishery characteristics. If it was a volume fishery, what types of gears were involved, and we wanted to have a diversity of fisheries represented kind of by the species that we were including. And then we also looked at culinary characteristics. So things like, is it a filletable fish? Is it typically sold whole? Is it a stronger flavored fish or mild flavored fish? We had a few crustaceans or shellfish, squid in there, some different culinary characteristics. And so all those factors were kind of included in the decision-making process for why we selected 12. And we wanted to have the region kind of divided. So northern New England was going to receive a little bit different set of species than the southern New England species. Another question says, are there any groups similar to yours trying to determine climate winter species on the West Coast that you know about? That's a great question. I believe, there's different research I don't think they're using the term climate winners necessarily. I feel like that might be us, but I think there are different research institutions that are definitely looking at species shifts overall. And I think that does all include at the federal level at NOAA and with Sea Grant. But I think you also see with some of the universities in particular, where a lot of the research is being done, some shifts happening, and some documentation of that. But I don't know, I haven't seen any like specifically coming out to be like, okay, like, Pacific Northwest, you're going to start receiving these species or whatever. I've seen it more in targeted at the academic, like in academic journals, and targeting at like talking about species shifts, like from more of a ecological perspective, I guess.
Yeah, one thing to add to that is I did see a study recently, or a couple of studies on market squid, kind of going from the California region and spreading northward towards Washington and Oregon. And they don't currently, to my knowledge, have a commercial fishery, and they're considering opening one up based on the shifts that they're seeing. So that's kind of one example, but we haven't seen anything especially like beyond the kind of theoretical into like practically how that would operate at a supply chain level, and whether the supply chain is kind of ready for those impacts as well. So that was a big motivation for the work that we're doing here.
Great. If we don't have any more questions, we're gonna kind of share a little bit more about the next steps with this roadmap portion of the project. We've got one more question or comment that says, you can find this kind of information in the climate vulnerability assessments that NOAA has done across many of the regions. There's one that just came out on the West Coast a year or two ago. So we mentioned one climate vulnerability assessment which was the one that John Hare did in the Northeast, that we based some of our species selections on or whatever. And so this is mentioning one that this is also happening kind of on the West Coast. So you can definitely check that out as a great source of information if you are West Coast based. Thank you, Marcia. All right, we're going to move on to the next section.
Yeah, so this brings us to kind of the goal of the next phase of this project, and hopefully your input, which is the roadmap for climate resilient seafood supply chains. And Kate, you can advance to the next slide, and that will have all the information on it. So our plan for the next year, as we said, is to work with suppliers and other industry members to construct a roadmap for climate resilient seafood supply chains. And the goal is to help suppliers build resilience into the future for species to species shifts. And to do this, we want to structure the plan under resilience pillars. This is kind of modeled after various roadmaps related to food systems, not so much in fisheries at the moment, although I'm sure there are other examples. But the pillars would be kind of bundles of essential ingredients that are necessary to build flexibility into the system, things like market access and different forms of collaboration and policy change. So the really like large kind of overarching themes. And within those pillars, we want to give examples of real life strategies being taken up by businesses and other collaborative initiatives. And those would kind of be our sort of bright spots. Things can get really kind of heavy and dreary with this type of work. And I think it's really important that we really, uplift what's already going on and be able to envision what's possible with what we have currently. But then we also want actions that are still needed to kind of fill out those pillars and ensure that the proper incentives and infrastructure are in place to do that. And that's the kind of necessary actions piece. So what still needs to be done? What's kind of our wish list, if you will. So all of this content is the subject of our discussion, which is coming up next. So to help us kind of build out the plan, we have a few questions for the group that we want to get your feedback on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put, I have a link in the chat right now, and that's going to be to a Google form. So you can let me know if there are any issues with accessing this form. It's not essential that you fill anything out on this form, but if you open that up, you can follow along to each of the questions. We're going to have 4, and we're going to walk through all of these in person. But you can use this space. You can think of it as a space to take notes on the responses, and then to be able to send all those comments back to us, which will be really helpful. Really with this, the more feedback, the better. And if you don't feel comfortable kind of voicing your answers in this session, you could also use this as a place to provide that information. But having said that, as we go through each of these questions, if you have an answer, please either say it out loud or the comments work just fine as well, so that the whole group can benefit. So there's 4 questions, as I said. We're gonna, I think we should be able to give at least a few minutes to each, and we'll try to do our best to move things along. But if we stay on one question, that's okay too, because I think we have enough time for that. Oh, I think Greta said it won't open. Okay. Let me see what I can do for the permissions. Kate, maybe if you're able to
You should be able
see
to
if you
change
can
it to
troubleshoot.
anyone with the link, if you change it in terms of permissions, but I can try to work on that real quick. I don't actually know, I don't think I'm the controller, but
Let me see. Might be under, sorry, it might be under settings. Okay, I just changed it so that,
yeah, that it worked.
okay, good. All right, my apologies. Again, this isn't like essential that you have it right now, but this is certainly something that would help us if you're able to kind of fill out some of those. Okay. So the first question is, are there specific businesses or climate resilient initiatives that you recommend we include in this plan as kind of resources or models for supply chain businesses? So as I said, some of the featured content in the plan is these kind of resilience pillars, which are those ingredients that we need to have in place to be kind of successful in the face of climate change. But then under that, we want to highlight examples of that in action. So this question is really pertaining to, what are those examples? Are there specific businesses or collaborative initiatives that come to mind? And if you're still having issues with the form, you could just type out your notes and I can figure that out right after so that you're able to submit it. But we'd love to hear your feedback right here in the session, because I think that would be really beneficial, not only for us, but I think for the whole group as well. So do any businesses or kind of initiatives really come to mind when you think about kind of those bright spots and ways that we can really move forward and the industry can move forward in the face of climate change? If you don't want to list a specific business or kind of initiative out loud, you could also just talk about, some of the characteristics that this would display. One example, when we interviewed a lot of the businesses that identified with kind of the climate winter adaptable mindset, they would host things like tastings at their retail shop or just educational programs that they had, especially if they had like a larger kitchen where they could host events and things related to the products that they were selling, but really with an overall goal to enhance education and kind of information for the consumer, and really for them to benefit from tasting and getting to know a wider variety of species.
I know a number of you, I'm looking at kind of like the list of attendees, and a bunch of you might represent kind of other organizations or research kind of, do your own research and stuff like that. So if there's also like, I guess, initiatives that you've heard about, but you aren't necessarily the business that has has partaken in those kind of initiatives or activities, we'd also love to hear from you kind of as researchers who work in the field, is like something that you think is important. All right, Greta added something into the chat. So it says a good way to make sure all small boat fishermen know what species that they are able to fish for that could be sold and where they need to be included and supported and even propped up for a while. So maybe unless you want rich corporate fishers to be the only ones to get on board. So like how to connect with fishermen and people, sellers willing to collaborate. So it sounds like really kind of connecting with the small scale fishermen and helping them connect with the people that are the end users or whatever, and willing, or other businesses who are willing to really kind of get involved and purchase those. I also see a comment from Lindsay that says easier and streamlined access to the fishermen. So that could be probably, I'm assuming, for businesses. So maybe if you are kind of a middle of the supply chain businesses, or even towards the end supply chain business, like a restaurant or something like that wants to purchase local seafood, sometimes that can be a challenge, knowing who to purchase from or where you can purchase it from. And so Lindsay's suggestion is like a much more streamlined kind of access to the fishermen.
And Lindsay, do you see, I'm wondering if you see any evidence of that today, like the makings of that, at least at kind of an early stage, or if you really think this is something that's more missing from the larger environment.
She says, ideally,
Yeah.
I'd love to see an app for that.
Yeah.
So I feel like those can always, I feel like apps can definitely help us kind of connect in many ways. And like utilizing technology can be kind of a cool tool to definitely help connect. One app that we've seen, so I live and work in Rhode Island, but one app that I've seen out there and has been being utilized by actually the state of Rhode Island through their Rhode Island Seafood Program is the Fish Line app. It was actually designed by a local catch member, I believe, and was presented at the Portland local catch meeting that we had back in like 2019. And but that's an app that was designed on the West Coast and has been adapted kind of to the East Coast, and allows the fishermen to post, for example, when they're coming into the port, and will have and what their catches and what they'll have and prices and all this kind of information, basically whatever information the fishermen would like to input, and then consumers can check the app and connect directly with fishermen that way. And it can be utilized beyond just consumers. It could also be utilized by other like retail markets or restaurants or other kind of purchasers. So that's one tool. And I know Joe Falcone, who's the designer of the app, is willing to work with different fishing communities to kind of tailor it to yours. Because I know in Rhode Island, they were able to update it to work kind of along the lines of what the regulations were for direct sales kind of in our state.
I think we'll move on to the next question, just in the interest of time. I actually just figured out. Oh, we
question.
did. Okay.
It says if more restaurant owners became fish dealers, at least for legalities here in North Carolina, they could purchase directly from commercial fishermen, or if more commercial fishermen became dealers and chose to deliver the products themselves, they'd have direct delivery to the restaurants that want the supply. And Anna says I work with restaurants that host fishermen dinners where the fishermen are there and able to speak about their product, their harvest methods, and share their story. And I think that's a really great point, Anna. Thank you for sharing that. And someone else commented, loving the educational piece for the fishermen dinners. I know we've done those type of events at Eating with the Ecosystem, and they've always been really kind of strong educational components and really a great network building and community building kind of events. So I 100% agree with this. I think it's one way for people to really get to understand their fishermen a lot better and understand some of the challenges that they face, and also ways that they can help support them. So plus they're really delicious and fun. So that's always a great bonus. So thank you, Anna, for sharing that. We are going to move on, I think, to the second question. So I'm going to have Nikki introduce that.
Yeah. And I'm actually going to repost the link because I think I got it working now. I'm sorry. I'm not the most technologically savvy. So you can go ahead and try that if you want. That's of course another place to take notes, but we really appreciate getting all this activity in the comments. That's what we're hoping for. So, but the next question here is also dealing with another content piece of the plan. And what we really want to know is, we talked about the resilience pillars, these kind of overarching things that are really needed to kind of all function together to help businesses deal with species shifts. And so that's the larger piece. And then there's also the necessary action. So those are kind of like smaller pieces that are currently missing. And so these elements, when we ask what elements could enhance the utility of this plan to industry or kind of policymakers, what we're really getting at is what are those kind of pillars and what would those missing pieces be? And I think we kind of covered some of this, but we also just wanted to provide a couple more potential examples. So they could include things like, specific aspects of regulatory policy, which we haven't discussed as much, or, processing infrastructure needs. We've discussed some other needs about the marketplace, and we can continue talking about those as well. But we just want to give more space to kind of the other elements that you feel like are really essential. Like when you think about climate resilience, when you think about adaptability, species shifts in the supply chain, what are the things that really come to mind that need to be functioning?
Yeah, one thing that I
oh, go ahead.
am thinking, Nikki, is in terms of policymakers, it would be interesting to see like an economic case for the value, both the impact of losing key species that are currently sort of money fish in different regions, and then the economic value of these climate winter species coming in, because I think at least at the level of decision-making policy decisions, there might be a strong motivator there to get kind of bipartisan support for changing fisheries policy to allow for more flexibility for fishers, or even thinking about like policy that regulates how restaurants can source from fishers and fishers can deliver to restaurants. That tends to change state by state. So yeah, that's one thought that I have.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. The economic case, like you said, can really bring a bipartisan lens to this topic as well. And part of the research, this kind of research project that Kate and I just talked about, is part of a larger project. And a piece of that project looked at some of these climate winter species and actually putting them into restaurants and kind of beta testing that and seeing, what are consumers thinking about these? What are restaurants thinking about these? What are their opinions, and how might they utilize them? And that's, I think if you kind of take that at face value and really building more demand, I think starts with it starts and ends with kind of the consumer. And if we have a kind of policy, I think if we have the demand side, then we can also make a case, like you said, the economic case to make changes to policy. And I'm curious as to what people think those policy changes, also like what those targeted policy changes possibly could be. And I think it's a couple of questions.
I want to add One is from Lindsay. It says, would love to see as a whole a New England food network where we're all sharing information or even creating a supply chain kind of within our region. And I don't know if some of you are familiar, there is a New England Feeding New England network that has started a regional approach to the New England food system. And you may have heard of the 30 by 30 goal, or 50 by 60 goal, but basically increasing the resilience of the New England food system by increasing the amount of local food kind of consumed within the region. And so that's a really, they've got a whole report out, and they have a whole seafood kind of subsection within that. And you can check out their website. That it's a great place to kind of start. But it sounds like what Lindsay is suggesting is being able to kind of share this information on a little bit more of a kind of quick kind of an up day-to-day kind of an adaptable way. And so I think that's a great suggestion. Greta also mentioned maybe the ability for fishers to know they have a market prior to fishing, so that they can plan for where their catch is going and plan how to keep the quality good to the end buyer, instead of just fishing and taking a chance that they can sell it, because that can be a really big risk. And I think that's a great point, Greta. I think it's one of the things that a lot of the local catch businesses tend to do really well when they have, for example, CSF type models where the people are signing up for a fish share ahead of time, kind of, and it helps ensure that the fishers do have a buyer kind of set up ahead of time. And so there's other ways to work and achieve that, but that's a great suggestion.
Yeah, and I think that's another point to the kind of the demand side needs, building the demand so then that there is the market that fishermen can actually rely on, because you're right, it's a big risk, and if you don't have the markets for the product, it's not going to be successful, and then there's no point in catching, because it just ends up going against your quota. So that's a really great point. I think we'll if there's no other comments, we can move on to the next question.
Can you see that, Nikki?
Oh, yep, I can. Yeah, I think it just lagged a little bit. So what this is getting at the climate winner species. So we mentioned there were 12 that we took a look at, but there could be many more. And obviously we were just focused on the New England region for the research. So we're especially interested in hearing, and it was mentioned that NOAA had some of those kind of climate vulnerability assessments that identified certain species that may be moving into the region. But I think an important piece is also just experiential knowledge and understanding out on the water, what might be going on. And I think businesses, especially close to the fishermen, have an important role to play in that. So, as we were presenting, are there any species that kind of came to mind that you think would kind of qualify in this category of climate winner species? Any that you'd either kind of heard through the grapevine might be increasing in your area, or some that you've actually just seen more of out on the water?
As you guys are thinking, like, that's northern puffer was on our list of species, and that might have seemed like a really kind of odd choice because it's not a huge commercial fishery, and especially up in New England at this point, or whatever. But one of the reasons that we added that one to the list was from feedback from fishermen, that they had been seeing them, and they were like, "Hey, is there any market for these? Are we allowed to catch them? What's like, will the dealers buy them? Things like that." And so that type of thing is really like, some of the information that can be really helpful, and that has a possibility for, developing a market down the line.
Yeah, and I mentioned puffer in her area.
Oh, lionfish.
Oh,
That's
lionfish.
a good one.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Invasive one. So
Yeah, I think there's already a lot of things, right? Kind of happening with trying to utilize lionfish in a variety of ways.
Yeah, and it's definitely one that I think has been expanding range, particularly with warmer water temperatures. So as waters have continued to warm, it's kind of like moving northward, which is somewhat scary because they're pretty voracious predators. And so yeah, they're actually really tasty, and they're ones that should, if you can develop kind of a market for them, could be really they're actually pretty versatile in terms of culinary characteristics. So that's a great suggestion. I hear. I see Greta's made a comment about how about cooperating with West Coast to backhaul their abundant species after hauling a load of clams from the East Coast, for example, sharing costs and exposing more people to more species.
Yeah, I'm wondering if that's if one of the limitations with that could be policy based, like regulatory guidelines. I'm not sure with like bycatch, for example. And that may be, if that were the case, that could be kind of a point for a little bit more inclusive and flexible regulatory policy.
Great, thank you, Greta, for sharing that. Anybody else have any kind of thoughts on species that you're seeing, or advice on marketing, particular species? One of the things that we've noticed in some of the other work that we've done is a lot of times when these species are just starting to show up, it's showing up in some smaller volumes, and it can be hard to kind of get I guess a lot of the bigger buyers to try things right away, and kind of chefs help set the trends, I think, for new species. And so if you have creative chefs in your area who are willing to kind of be a little bit more experimental, we found that that's been kind of a strong way to start introducing different species to different areas. And I see another comment from Anna that says stone crab keeps migrating north with warmer waters, and are abundant where she is also. So that's another one that I think of Florida and stone crab. And so I'm not exactly sure where Anna is, but I'm assuming maybe like mid-Atlantic region, just based on some of her comments. And so they're starting to see them a little bit, farther north, kind of in her region. Oh, Wilmington, North Carolina. Great. Thank you.
Yeah, good to know. Thank you.
And then I also see Lindsay commenting that black sea bass does like really well in restaurants. Great. Thank you, Lindsay.
Yeah.
And that's definitely what we've seen shifts of. They're finding it as far north as the Gulf of Maine right now. So,
Kate, I think we can skip ahead to the next, after this question, to the last slide, because that really connects just to the final. Yes, you can skip this one because this is just asking for interest, but yeah, we kind of have this on the final slide. So there are a bunch of ways that people here can learn more and be active participants in this work. We really appreciate your active participation here. Sounds like people are interested and excited about this. We want this really to be the best possible resource as we can make it, and that really requires diverse feedback and contributions. So even those here who responded today, if you could take a look at the questions again on the Google form, which we'll send around as a link again, which I think you have access to at this point, it will directly inform the content for the plan moving forward. So we would really appreciate you just kind of filling out any additional comments or questions or responses you might have on that form. And we also just want to quickly plug another event that we have coming up. It's a working session. It's happening on March 11th. This is open to any New England-based seafood business. So that could be, a fisherman, a retailer, and really this is kind of like a more in-depth dive into all of the topics we discussed here to help build out the plan. So for more information on that or anything else related to the work, you can email us. We'll provide all of our contact information. And yeah, I'll hand it over, Lawton, if you just want to round things out for a minute. I know we're slightly over time.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Nikki and Kate, for sharing your research today. Thank you to everyone who was able to attend. please continue to tune in for more webinars that we'll be hosting throughout the winter. And again, I'll be following up to all who attended or intended to attend, and we'll send out that form so that folks can continue to add their ideas as thoughts come up. So yeah, again, thank you all for being here and for engaging, and we'll see you at the next one.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.